The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
The really interesting, lasting creative ideas stick, and they sort of carve a place in my memories, and so just the practice of recalling and sitting down in silence and recalling previous ideas or previous story concepts is an interesting exercise in and of itself.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Julian Vaca is the author of The Memory Index, a novel set in a world where a disease has ravaged human memories and people depend on artificial recall. Julian Vaca, I'm so glad to have you on the Habit Podcast today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
So when we're recording this, your book has not released yet, but it'll be releasing right about the time this episode releases. The Memory Index, your first novel.
That's correct.
Tell me a little bit about that book. Let's give us an overview.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always tell people that I enjoy writing in the genre that I enjoy reading the most, and obviously, writers are readers first. And I've just always gravitated toward speculative fiction, specifically for young readers, for young adults.
Uh-huh.
And so the Memory Index is really a kind of a cocktail of a lot of different things that I enjoy. First and foremost, the main character, Freya, she is Mexican-American, just like myself. Yeah. And so with the character, with her hero's journey, I was able to draw from experiences from my own childhood, being a first-generation Mexican-American, navigating rural Tennessee. And so it was really important for me to ensure that the character was authentic in that respect. And then, of course, I really enjoy science fiction and fantasy. And so, I really wanted to, have that sort of be my sandbox, my playground. Yeah. And then, of course, the 80s are in vogue right now and have been for a while. And so I thought it might be fun to sort of imagine a 1980s that was sort of impacted by rapid memory loss. And I've always been fascinated by memories as well. And so all that to say, the Memory Index is sort of, all of those different elements pulled together. Because any good sci-fi is really just, the genre is really just a vehicle for unpacking human themes, the human condition. And so even though we start with this interesting, hook, I was really more interested in exploring questions like, are we more than the sum of our own memories? Or another question that I unpack really in the second book more so is just how intimidating the thought of, really just asking the question, what's more intimidating, losing your memories or confronting the difficult ones? And so all that to say, the memory index is very much me sort of exploring and unpacking those questions through the subgenre of speculative fiction for young adults.
Yeah. So the idea here is there's been an illness that has ravaged people's memories, and then they depend on artificial
recall. That's correct. So in the book, the sort of Skynet of my world, Memory Frontier, they've developed artificial recall, which is essentially you're scanned by this device called a reader, a memory reader, and it locates at-risk memories, imprints them onto memory tapes, and then you play those back a set number of times until you relearn that particular memory. Then you discard it and move on to the next one. But at the start of the novel, Memory Frontier has announced groundbreaking medical technology that's going to forever change mankind's battle with memory loss. But they need to trial this new tech. And so they lottery 500 random students from across the country and send them to a boarding school in Tennessee. But of course, when the main character arrives, not everything is as it seems. And so that's sort of the hook.
Yeah. That's interesting that you the memory reader is called a me reader because you just asked the question, is our memory ourselves?
Yeah.
And in some important ways it is, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, even, as I'm reflecting on my own childhood and drawing from my own memories and, sort of going through that sort of exercise, and really memories are a form of storytelling. I think we talked about this earlier when we were, corresponding via email, and it's something that I think about often. Storytelling, oral storytelling is memory preservation in a lot of ways. And I'm just super fascinated by that. And I think, this idea of, preserving our own history, our own heritage through oral storytelling is more urgent than ever, with so many different distractions, so many things vying for our attention, whether it's social media, whether it's, streaming. I mean, we just live in such an age of instant gratification. And so more than ever, it's important for us to continue that sort of tradition of oral memory sharing, of oral storytelling. Yeah.
You mentioned that you're Mexican-American, first generation, I think you said. Tell me about the oral storytelling tradition in that
culture. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll provide just a little bit of context and then, lead into that question. So my mom immigrated from Mexico when she was very young. And, both my parents are bilingual. My grandparents were actually 3 out of 4 of my grandparents only spoke Spanish. But interestingly, my parents were very much of the sort of mindset that, okay, you're in America, you are going to speak English exclusively. We're not going to teach you Spanish. Really? And so the thinking was it might impede or hold us back academically. And so, there was always kind of this barrier growing up in terms of, trying to embrace my heritage because I didn't speak the language. Yeah. And then when, I spent my formative years in rural Tennessee, when we moved over here from Southern California, I started to notice that most of my friends in this rural town where I grew up were white. And so I had this interesting kind of, I guess you could call it like a crisis of identity at a young age, because on the one hand, I couldn't fully embrace my heritage because I didn't speak the language, but then I always felt sort of disconnected from my white friends because I looked a little different. And so in the midst of all that, one of the ways that I could sort of connect with my heritage and my parents and their story was hearing those stories from my mom.
Yeah.
Hearing those stories of how she and my aunts and uncles, she's one of 9, how they came over from Mexico when she was young, their journey to citizenship. Yeah. All those kinds of things. So I think in my unique story, or in my unique instance, storytelling was that much more important because it was how I connected my present to, my past.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. So this book, you chose to set this book in an alternative 1987. Now, I don't know how old you are, Julian, but you look like you may not remember a whole lot about 1987.
It's funny that you say that because multiple people have said that already. And I think, I definitely look younger than I am. If you can believe it, my wife and I we actually have 4 kids. Okay. And we actually, this is a sidebar, but we actually technically have 5. Our third has a twin in heaven. But we had kids. We started having kids at a young age. I was born in 87. Okay. And as a child of the 90s, I was definitely consuming a lot of pop culture from the 80s. Yeah. But the decision to set it in the 80s was I really wanted to play with analog technology, so tape decks, Walkman, and VHS camcorders. I just thought it would be interesting if humanity was, if we had to confront this enigmatic plague-like phenomenon like memory killer with analog technology. Uh-huh. Yeah. Because the story almost doesn't work if you said it today, where smartphones are ubiquitous, and I mean there's just and so
I wondered if that was a big part of that choice. The fact cell phones make storytelling hard.
Yeah, it's true.
If Romeo and Juliet had cell phones, right, that disaster at the end wouldn't have happened.
It's true. It's true.
I don't want to spoil the end of Romeo and Juliet, but
Yeah, to anyone who's listening who's not familiar with the ending, sorry. You're absolutely right. I think as a storyteller, I'm always conscious of elements in my story that might date the story itself. You always want, unless you're being intentional with the atmosphere, which obviously I was. 1987. It's clearly. I guess you could technically say it's historical fiction in that sense.
Please don't say that. When you said the 80s are big now, I thought the 80s were really big when I was in high school.
That's fair enough.
Fair enough. In 1987.
Well, we can.
A campus minister friend of mine, his students said they were telling about some 80s party they'd been to. They said, "Did you have 80s parties when you were in school?" He says, "Yeah, we called them parties."
Listen, I can kind of empathize with that, Jonathan, because I've started meeting a lot of young professionals who, when they tell me that they were born in the early aughts, I'm like, it blows my mind. Like that there's young people out there who were born after 9/11, which is kind of like like a history landmark. As I sort of think back on my childhood and my youth, 9/11 has always sort of been like a historical mile marker. Sure. But anyway, all that to say, I'm always intentional about elements or details in the story that that I can, withhold or sort of restrain so that it feels evergreen. Because I've noticed when I go back and read books from 5, 6, 7 years ago, they'll reference things in technology or something that's, even now is outdated, whether it's a online tool or something like Napster, I don't know. But you see the point.
Yeah. You said this is historical fiction, which is fair enough. Except that it's also alternative 1987, where this thing has happened.
Yeah.
That obviously didn't happen in 1987. And so I'm interested in we're used to the idea of, let's talk about a dystopian future or this is set in the near future where the following thing happened. I was a little surprised to learn, when I knew this was a story about a memory plague, I just assumed it was set in the future. And then it turns out it's set in 1987. You've already said part of that was an interest in telling the story without digital technology, which that makes a lot of sense. And so like you just sort of have a nostalgia for an age that you kind of missed. It's too bad you missed it. It was great. I mean, but I'd love to hear more about that choice. Yeah. And I'm also super interested in, what were the challenges that presented to you as a storyteller?
Absolutely. Well, one of the other decisions that went into, setting the story in the 1980s was atmosphere. And I adore music as an art medium. I think it's one of the more transcendent art mediums that we're fortunate enough to indulge in. And so, 80s music and really just music in general, plays a role in the story. And so, I did tons of research, obviously, in preparation for this story. And I came across something really interesting. There's this practice called, it's basically where you play mood matching music while you're doing tasks or chores around the house, or you play atmospheric or orchestral music while you go about your day. And studies have found that the pairing of the music with the doing of the task, whatever it is, helps to sort of cement that moment and create a lasting memory. And so all that to say, I really wanted atmosphere to play a role in the story. And so that's why there's an accompanying playlist with the book where I cataloged every song that's referenced in the book. And there's a QR code in the back of the book where readers can scan it and it'll take them to their streamer of choice, Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And so, again, atmosphere, music, sort of pop culture was important to me to make that feel authentic to the story, not to feel gimmicky, of course, because you can certainly overplay that hand. But I really wanted that to more support the story. And then so that was another reason why I wanted to set it in the 80s. And then also, we've learned so much about the human brain since then. But, back then there was still a lot of uncertainty. There were still a lot of lingering questions. A lot of the things that we know now back then might have just been revelations or newly discovered. And so all those kinds of, decisions or all those kinds of elements played into the decision, I should say, to set this in the 80s. So, yeah.
Yeah. Were there any difficulties, challenges, that any problems you had to solve that come to mind?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is, and this is less about like the technical, medical aspect of the story itself, and this is more just like practical in terms of like how the story is structured. When I pitched this to my publisher, it was initially going to be a trilogy. And because I'm a debut author, they said, well, how about 2 books? So I had to sort of take the outline and the idea for the story, which initially spanned 3 books, and rework that into 2. And I got to say, I'm really glad that they, pushed back and that we arrived at 2 books versus 3, because it forced me to make a lot of, creative choices. It forced me to, really pick and choose what, remained in the story, what was pertinent to the story. So I say that was the first challenge. And then the other thing that was challenging with the story. So I come from a background of self-publishing. Before I was traditionally published, I self-published. I used a tool called CreateSpace, which it's now Amazon's print-on-demand service. But essentially, you only sell copies when they're purchased. So you don't have to buy like a pallet of 500 and hope they sell. So anyway, I come from self-publishing. And so learning the ins and outs of traditional publishing there was a learning curve there. I had to, really exercise a lot of trust. Before, I was wearing a lot of hats. I was, the decision maker in a lot of different elements, but now I have a team and I have to trust them. So that was certainly a learning curve as well.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Memory. We got to talk about memory a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've done some thinking about the relationship between memory and creativity. So I just love to talk about that. This is something I've done a little thinking about too. So
yeah.
But you go first.
Yeah. So the marriage of memory and creativity, it's really fascinating because, as a creative, that muscle is always working in my head. I'm always observing conversations at coffee shops or, listening to music or watching something on TV or reading something, and an idea will pop in, creativity will strike. But I don't always have the opportunity to, pull out my notebook and jot that idea down. And so, because oftentimes creativity strikes in the car when I'm listening to music. For some reason, I have found that is when a lot of my ideas will pop into my head. And you know what? Over time, a lot of those ideas will sort of drift into the wind, and then I'll just forget them altogether. But the really interesting, lasting creative ideas stick, and they sort of carve a place in my memories. And so just the practice of recalling and sitting down in silence and recalling previous ideas or previous story concepts is an interesting exercise in and of itself. And then journaling is an exercise in taking your thoughts and your ruminations, your musings, and sort of putting them on paper and preserving them. And so in a lot of ways, that's kind of memory preservation too.
Yeah.
And there's been studies that show, when you write with pen to paper, it's far more creatively stimulating than keyboard and computer. So yeah, I know I'm kind of all over the place, but there is a really interesting marriage of creativity and memory. I'm curious what, you've kind of considered about the two.
I a previous episode of this podcast with Jessica Hooten Wilson, she mentioned something that I had never put together, and that is that the word invention comes from the same word as inventory. And so that when we invent, from a storytelling perspective, as a fiction writer, you're free to make up whatever you want to make up. To invent what you want to invent. But it's interesting that whoever sort of put those words together, right, as the language developed, the idea of what's already in your, my invention is not really my invention. I'm not creating ex nihilo, right? I am putting together things that have been in my memory before. Yeah. And that is my memory that ties me to the past is also the way I move forward and make new things.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really interesting idea.
Yeah, that is. And, as Christians, as Christian creatives, I think it's especially fascinating too. Like when you look at the Bible, the entire narrative of, the New Testament is sort of drawing from and recalling, what happened in the Old Testament. And so, we see that on the page in the Bible. So yeah, that's a really fascinating idea, something fascinating to consider. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, as you read through scripture, it's amazing how often that idea of remembering comes up.
Yeah.
and how often, in the Old Testament, they'll say, let's just pause a minute and run through. Remember, you were enslaved in Egypt, and then you walked through the Red Sea, and the Lord drowned the Egyptian armies. And then, and it's really remarkable how often that story comes up again.
It's true. It's true.
Let's remember. And that's what Passover is. Let's remember the night that we were delivered, and the Lord's Supper. Remember and proclaim.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Now, so as you've already alluded, our journals, our stories, these are repositories of memory, right? Your book is about memories, a memory that's outside our brain. We have memories in our inside. We also have external memories, and some of those are stories that we didn't even write.
Yeah,
right. So that stories are a repository of cultural memory. And although I read this article, I actually looked it up again this morning. It was from 2006, so it's 16 years old, so I guess it is stuck in my memory for sure. But it described these huge epics that were written in India that for generation after generation were passed down as an oral tradition among sort of I don't know if they were monks or if there was sort of a community of again, I think monks is the wrong word, but a community of mystics or religious people who lived together, passed these stories on. And I mean, it was like one of these epics was much, much longer than the Iliad, for instance. And it was just something that they memorized and passed down orally. Well, somebody got an idea that makes a lot of sense to me. Let's go write it. Let's go dictate it. Right?
Yeah.
And you may know where the story is going. When they went to dictate it and it was written down, people lost their ability to remember it. I mean, so I think that's really interesting that the written word is a way of preserving memory, but it also externalizes memory in such a way that our internal memory, it does something to our internal memory.
Yeah, that's
whatever reason, I guess those monks or whoever they were, knowing that it was written down, just couldn't quite bring themselves to keep it in their heads.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm going to have to dig that article up and look into that. I'm really fascinated by that, specifically because one of the things that I explore, without giving too much away in the book, is the importance of shared memories in terms of building those shared memories or those moments with our community, and just the importance of memory building together and sort of that togetherness with our community. And so like I was just very, very, very fascinated with that whole idea. There's this interesting phenomenon called transactive memory, which, it's something I came across in the research. It's basically this idea of, if you have multiple people experiencing something and committing whatever that experience is to, together, committing that to memory. And as a shared memory, that sort of exercise helps preserve it with more authenticity over time. And so that's kind of a phenomenon I sort of explored in the book as well. But I'd be really curious to read that article.
The article is called Homer in India, and it's in the New Yorker. So if you Google Homer in India, you'll see it.
Yeah, I'll check that out.
Think about, I bet you've had this experience. You've got a group of friends and you've known each other for a long time. And it's interesting who remembers which stories. I'll sort of tell back stories to my friends. Like, I remember, you're the one who told me that story. I don't know if you know Randall Goodgame, but he has a terrible memory for his own stories. And so he'll tell me a story, and then I'll sort of, later say, remember that time you told me about what? And he's like, I don't remember that at all. And so Randall's a person who has sort of external memories of the people around him, sort of remember things that he forgets.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, memories can be these sort of elusive, unreliable things too, which is another reason why I think it's so important to at least take those, monumental moments in our own life and commit them to diaries or journals.
Yeah. Here I raise mine Ebenezer.
Yeah. Well, I think it's why a lot of us have an obsession with capturing stuff on our cameras, on our phones, our video cameras on our phone, because it sort of takes the need, or dare I even say the responsibility to, remember things because it's on our phone now. And so I have it there. And so I do wonder too, how much of an impact, a long-term impact that has had on us, because we've become so reliant on just, I can just pull out my phone and take a video of that. But yeah, I think.
And so I don't even experience in the present.
Right.
Because I'm saving it to my external memory device.
Yeah, which is something that I tried to speak to in the second book of this duology. Just this idea of being so obsessed with, the act of imprinting these memories to be able to recall them later, that we lose sight of the now and the present. And so, yeah, I think years from now, we'll definitely be able to point to the long-term negative effects of being able to just pull out our phones and take pictures and record on video like that. So, we'll see.
Yeah.
Can't be good.
It can't. I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be good, but I'm not good at predicting these things, right? And if there were ways to use that preserved mental capacity and energy for more positive things, maybe it would be a good thing. In my one of my sons was in what science class would it be where I don't think they took astronomy. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He was in a class where the teacher was trying to explain some mathematical principle of the heavens, and he said, so how might we figure out the circumference of the earth? This boy raised his hand and said, Google it.
Oh gosh. If that isn't emblematic of where, oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and here's the thing. I will say that's funny. As a writer, it has afforded us the luxury of being able to research very, it's just, I have a writer buddy who, he set his, one of his novels in New England. And he, at the time of writing the first draft of the manuscript, he hadn't visited that region of America yet. And so he just did a bunch of Google Earth searches to sort of get a sense of atmosphere and setting. I do think later on he made a trip. But yeah, I mean, the luxury that we're afforded as writers in 2022 and beyond, there's definitely some pros as as there are many cons, sure, but there's definitely some benefits too.
Right. I'm curious, why was your friend setting a story on a place he'd never been? Presumably he'd been other places.
Oh, for sure. I think he was really struck or really interested in stepping out of his comfort zone and going to new places and sort of the challenge of writing in a new environment. And so, you hear people often say you write what you know. And sometimes that can pigeonhole you, because as writers, we want to be able to, explore and unpack new and interesting things in our writing, but we want to do it with authenticity. We want to do it with a sense of credibility too, because we don't want our readers to feel as if they can't trust us, as if we're not, air quotes, experts in whatever it is that we're writing. So I think he really liked the challenge of, well, I've never been there. I want to go there, So he started with Google Earth images, but then eventually he did end up going up there. And I think if I had to guess, he's never said that explicitly, but if I had to guess, that would be why.
Yeah. All right. I want to switch gears, if you don't mind, because you had a blog post that I found very interesting over at your website. And this was the idea that, and we don't have to, you don't say any more about this than you're comfortable saying, but since you blogged about it, I think you're comfortable talking about it. And that is the idea that your tendency to, as your tendencies and your gifts as a storyteller, it's possible for that to go wrong in your own sort of, for lack of a better word, mental health. We're always making up stories about that explain our situation. And then sometimes we forget that we made up those stories.
Yeah.
And live, we've made up a fictional story and then live into that story as if it were reality.
Yeah.
And then you also said, through the help of a friend, that you were able to redirect your narrative energies to something that was a little healthier. So can you talk about that a little bit? I'd love to hear more about that.
Absolutely. This is something I'm very passionate about. I think as a Christian, I believe that, Satan, the enemy, hijacks, what God has gifted us, our talents, our skills, what God has intended for good. I think Satan can hijack and warp that to our detriment. And specifically in my life as a storyteller, as a creative writer, I've struggled for years with insecurity, and various forms, various manifestations of anxiety. And one of the things that I experienced specifically in my marriage was in what my therapist called intrusive thoughts. And it's where, your insecurity sort of plants this seed, this false narrative that starts to bloom the more you sort of water it and the more you sort of tend to it. And that intrusive thought can just grow into just these weeds. And before you know it, you're leaning into and believing something that's completely fictitious, something that didn't even happen. And so I was doing that in my marriage, in my friendships, where, I would feel insecure about something, and then my mind would race and I would write these stories and I would start to believe them. And then, I would close up and I would start treating others. I would start treating my wife as if that thing that I dreamed up was real. Yeah. And so, through, lots of therapy and through, help from my community and through the grace of both God and my wife, I was able to recognize that, that's all a fiction, and that's all, those intrusive thoughts. I can sort of reclaim that sort of part of creativity and redirect it and use it for good. And I believe, that creating is one of the ways that we can give God, the ultimate creator, glory. And so I tell people I'm a Christian writer, but I don't create Christian art. So I write for general market, general audiences. And I like to smuggle in elements of my faith and convictions that I have, my beliefs, into the stories. But I firmly believe that, as a Christian creative, that's one of the practical ways that we can worship, is through creating art. And so that journey taught me a lot of different things. And I've certainly not arrived, I'm still learning, and relearning certain things. But, and it's helped that, as a culture, as a society, we've, mental health awareness is, on everyone's tongue, on everyone's mind. It's a part of the conversation now.
Yeah.
And I think that our generation, my generation, is sort of reclaiming this idea of, going and getting counseling and getting therapy and addressing mental health in viewing it as a really positive thing. I think previous generations might have viewed that as, oh my gosh, you're going to counseling. Well, what's wrong? What's going on? Like, and now it's, it's like anything else, you go to physical therapy, you go, I appreciate you asking.
Yeah. I love that sort of framing of making that connection between this. And by the way, it's not like there's a special class of storyteller, creative storytellers who make up image, stories in their mind. I mean, everybody is at least that kind of storyteller. Like, we're always coming up with stories to explain
absolutely
situations we find ourselves in. And it's amazing how wrong we are so often in the story, why that person didn't acknowledge me.
Yeah.
Across the room at the coffee shop. There are a whole lot of reasons somebody didn't acknowledge you across the way. And a lot of them are pretty innocent. And somehow we skip straight to the more dramatic, they hate me, or I've offended them, or whatever. And I love the idea of redirecting those narrative energies that we all have, right? And you suggested in your blog post that maybe the fact that you spend a lot of your time crafting stories, that maybe it was even more intense, these intrusive thoughts perhaps for you. And again, I don't know, I don't have any way of adjudicating whether that's true or not true, whether it's harder for you than that, and you don't have any way of knowing either, right? Who knows how hard it is for other people? But we do know that we're all storytellers, for better or worse. And it's really helpful to think in terms of, let me harness these storytelling tendencies that are there for better and not for worse.
I think you're absolutely right. And case in point, when my friends and acquaintances started to learn that I was, publishing my first book with, traditionally, I can't tell you, Jonathan, how many people reached out to me and said, hey, I've always had a novel, a story that I've wanted to tell. Can I buy you coffee and pick your brain on the process? So I think all of us have a bent toward storytelling. And I think we all have a unique voice and a story to tell. And so, I can't count on both hands how many times that's happened in the last, 6, 7, 8 months.
Yeah, sure.
Everybody, I think, has that intrinsically in them, that need, that sort of urgency to want to tell a story.
Yeah. All right, Julian, we got to bring this thing into the station. So I'm going to end with my typical ending question, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
So I love this question because at the top of the episode, I mentioned how I believe all writers are, readers first, obviously. And so, I can, certainly point to like my Mount Rushmore of writers. And I think back to some of the earliest books that I read and certainly, gosh, it's a cliche, I know, but I remember the first time I read The Hobbit. Mm-hmm. I was just enthralled and just couldn't put it down. I devoured J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. Just devoured. It's the only fiction series that I've read all the way through twice. Because my TBR list is so long, I try to use my energy and time towards new fiction, new stuff. But that's the one that I came back to. Yeah. And then so definitely, definitely Tolkien, definitely J.K. Rowling. I love Brandon Sanderson. He's a fantasy science fiction writer based out of Utah. Yeah. He was in the news recently for doing a Kickstarter for his books and the whole shakeup with publishing and all that stuff. But his stories actually really are great. And he's very generous with his insight. He's got an awesome YouTube channel where he posts his BYU lectures. I encourage anyone listening to this who is interested in craft to go look up Brandon Sanderson's
he's
YouTube channel.
So generous. You're right.
Yeah. So those are definitely some authors, some writers that come to mind. And of course, I think C.S. Lewis, what's so great about him is that he was the perfect balance of, interesting stories and allegory and fiction, but then, he's got Problem of Pain. He's got, Mere Christianity, these musings, these, writings on, gosh, I'm sure every other guest has said C.S. Lewis. So my apologies.
A lot have, sure. Yeah. there's a reason, right?
He's great. Yeah, he's great. So yeah, those are definitely some of the top authors that come to mind. How about you? Can I flip the script and ask, who are some of your favorite writers? There's two different questions. Who are your favorite writers? And then who are the ones that make you want to sit down and write? Sure.
Right.
Fair.
And so an answer I often give, or who actually makes me want to go write something, is Charles Portis. Not super well known, but he wrote True Grit. And he's not going to go down in history as one of the greats of all time or anything like that. But when I read what he writes, I think what he does there is kind of like what I want to do, but he does it better. And I want to be better at what I do when I see his. And then, Wendell Berry, Marilyn Robinson.
How could I forget Wendell Berry? His poetry. I'll say in the poetry medium, Wendell Berry is someone who makes me want to write.
Yeah.
It's the beauty in his simple prose. It's just, but he can turn a phrase, and so he's great. He's incredible.
Yeah. Then of course Flannery O'Connor. That's my other big one. Who again, sort of, not that I have ambitions to be the greatest American short story writer of all time, like I think she was, but she does things in such a way that I think that's kind of the way I want to do things, right? And then when I read, the example of writers I love that don't make me want to go write is, I love Faulkner. Never going to write like Faulkner. Don't have any interest in writing that way, but still love what he does. And I love John Milton, but don't read Paradise Lost and say, I think I'm going to go do that, right? So
I like that twist on the question, because I love reading Neil Gaiman. But I'm not going to write American Gods. I'm not going to write. He can get pretty graphic, and he can get pretty racy in some of his content. But of course, he has some other stuff that's a little bit more tame, like Stardust. But yeah, I don't. That's an interesting spin on the question. Who's a writer maybe that you admire who you wouldn't necessarily want to aspire to write like them.
Right. It's just not, it's not what I'm able to do, or it's not where my gifts lie.
Sure.
Quite apart from the content, but my gifts just don't, I'm old enough to know what sort of direction my gifts point. And it points a little more in the direction of what Flannery O'Connor does than what Faulkner does. Yeah. That's
awesome.
All right, Julian, thank you. We better run, but thank you so much for your time. This has been fun to talk to you. So
thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.